Hi, welcome to Tasty Treats 2020. We're doing the house sampler blocks. So we're making 20 different blocks set into house blocks so that they look like they're houses, I guess. And we're doing the roofs later. So at the moment we're just making the blocks. We've been making a few, so we've already made 8 blocks. So we're on to block 9 already. So this is what we're going to be making today. So similar because it's half square triangles to what we've done, but they're a different size and we're doing more like a 4-patch than a 9-patch this time. So it's all available through my website, GourmetQuilter.com, Tasty Treats House Sampler Blocks. And so if you've had getting the pattern, it's going to look something like this. And I've already cut out my patches, ready to go. So we needed to have a couple of squares. So these are a little bit larger than we've been working with, and we're going to be putting them together a little bit differently this time. So we need to create the half square triangles. So these units here, which are very like these units, but they're just larger, but we can make them a little bit differently to use the fabric differently this time. So we're still going to mark a diagonal line on the back of our background squares, just the center line from point to point, because we're going to be using all of the squares on these blocks. And so this time, instead of drawing another line to stitch on further away, we're just going to stitch 1/4 of an inch either side of the drawn line. So not sewing on the line this time, but sewing 1/4 of an inch either side. Now you could, if you wanted to, draw another line 1/4 of an inch away to sew on, but you don't necessarily need to, especially if you've got a 1/4 inch foot on your sewing machine. You can just pop the drawn line next to the edge of the foot and that will give you your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to go ahead now and sew those. So I'll show you how I do that. And then we're going to be cutting on our drawn line this time, so just a little bit different to what we've been doing. So now I'm just going to be sewing right next to that drawn line. So I'm going to position my foot so that the edge of it, perhaps I'll sew the other side first so you can see that. Position my foot so that you can see that the line is right on the edge of the foot, and just sew that 1/4 inch seam all the way along. So just keeping the edge of your foot lined up with that drawn center line there. And you can still chain piece if you want to. You can just have the other one ready to bring in and do that. And then when we've done both of them like this, we need to turn them around and sew down 1/4 of an inch away on the other side of the line as well. So I'll just go ahead and do that. So here I am coming back down the other side of the line now. That wasn't quite so painful. And we need to just cut those apart now. So, oops, I'm a bit close in to use that. So I'll just snip those threads between the two. So we need to cut those apart now. And then we can press them. And then they will just need a little bit of a trim. Only a little bit of a trim, but it's worth doing to get the pieces the right size so that the block goes together nicely. So I'm just going to press these into the colour. So we've got all 4 patches rearranged basically. We had 4 squares to start with. We've still got 4 squares, but they look a bit different now. So we've got our nicely pressed squares that are now 2 triangles joined together, and we just need to trim them up a little bit. So I have actually already gone ahead and trimmed a couple, but I'll show you how I'm doing the trimming. It's worth trimming them. They're very close to the size, as you can see here. There's not much that's being cut off, but it makes all the difference when you're sewing things together. So if you happen to have a square ruler, that's really good. If you don't, you can do it with a regular ruler. You just have to measure it slightly differently. Most of us have got these square rulers. They've mostly got this diagonal line on them. They've often got little other markings along the way which you might not necessarily enjoy using, but we find that they're actually amazingly useful. So what we're trying to do is trim our squares to measure a particular size to fit the block and things. So we want to line up the diagonal line with our ruler, we want to position it on there, and we just want to trim it. So you've got to make sure that where you're cutting, where you're wanting to trim to, is all fitting on your square so that you can trim it off. Now some of the trimmings might be very tiny, like little just whiskers. Some might be a little bit bigger. It may seem that your sewing is a little bit wonky, and possibly it can be a little bit wonky, but also just remember that we are working with a very movable commodity. So things do move a little bit, they change. Fabric is not a rigid item, so it can move around a little bit. So things can just slip and slide just a little bit more than we realise sometimes. So just trim them up to the right size so that we can join up and make our blocks. It's worth trimming off, as I said, all these funny little whiskery bits. It may seem a little tedious, but if a thing's worth doing, as my mother used to say, it's worth doing well. So I've now trimmed off my little whiskers of fabric there, and I've got my 4 squares the right size to make a block, and so we've just now got to position them the right way. You can actually make 2 pieces the same and then turn them around for ease of thinking about things, because if we put those 2 together and then we turn that piece around, we're going to find we get this sort of pinwheel effect going around. So that's kind of helpful to be able to pop them through, especially if you were making several of these blocks, that you could set your pairs up and chain piece them through. And then we can press the seams one way, both the same way, same thing, because when you turn it round the seam is going to go the opposite way. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch these 2 together in pairs. So this is, instead of what we've been making little 9-patch blocks. This one's actually just a 4-patch block because there's 4 patches. Quite simple really. So because we've pressed our seams towards the colour, we can nestle those where they're meeting down there as well. So it's all working well so far. So I've sewn them both, and I'm going to press them both the same way. So they're both sitting the same at the moment. So we know that if we press them both in the same direction, when we turn that one around, it's going to be absolutely perfect to join together. So, and these seams will nestle nicely in the centre, which should give us a nice point in the middle of our block, which is what we're aiming for. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that seam across now. So that's my block. I'm going to press this one, but I'm going to press this seam open because there's an extra bulk, and my points are looking pretty good in the centre there. But instead of pressing this to one side, because we've got a whole lot of bulk going on in that centre with those corners all meeting, I'm going to press this seam open, which will just help it sit a little bit better and flatter in the centre. Those other seams, and then press it from the right side as well, and I think that's looking pretty reasonable. And now I'm just going to have to put the frames on for the house walls. So we've got our 2 sides and our top and bottom, and it's nearly done, so I'll go ahead and put the frames on and show you the block when it's all finished. I'm just sewing the last side of the frame on. Just make sure your seams are sitting nice and flat underneath there. And we're ready to press. That's looking pretty good. So there's our block. This is block number 9, looking a whole lot like the other blocks. And whoops. So that's it. We've done 9 blocks out of our 20. So this is the house sampler blocks for tasty treats on GourmetQuilter.com. So thank you for watching with block 9 and hopefully all the others as well. And we'll see you again for block 10.